Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to proceed with our agenda this evening. At this point, I'd like to ask Eric Davis to please come forward and share his thoughts with us.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let's see, can I move this microphone over here so I can see what does this thing turn? Where can I turn this? Yeah, that works a little better, I think. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dr. Sabah al-Nasri for inviting me. And I want to speak on some research I'm conducting on Iraq. I'm finishing up a book called Taking Democracy Seriously in Iraq. And while Iraq is not technically part of the Arab Spring, because I think most people would limit that to those countries in which autocrats have been overthrown, such as in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, and of course unfinished business in Bahrain and Syria. But many Iraqis would actually argue that the Arab Spring began in Iraq in February and March of 1991 when there was a big uprising or intifada against Saddam Hussein's regime. And many people are unaware of the fact that Saddam would have been overthrown in 1991 had it not been for the intervention of American forces to A, allow Iraqi helicopter gunships to go into the air. The Iraqi army was down to 4 days of ammunition and was about to collapse due to two uprisings in the south among the Arab population and in the north among the Kurds. And in addition to that, I've interviewed a lot of American troops who are actually on Iraqi soil who were told to destroy ammunition dumps so they would not fall into the hands of the insurgents. So many Iraqis would actually say, we began the Arab Spring. If it hadn't been for the United States, we would today be in a very different situation. I think if you think about had Saddam Hussein been overthrown in 1991, I probably wouldn't even be standing here today. So let's begin first by talking about U.S. occupation. First of all, let me be clear about my position. I think Saddam Hussein should have been removed from power. There were 22 tons of documents that were captured in 1991 with all sorts of indications of the fact that he was complicit in genocide and massive human rights violations, documents signed by him himself. There was a website called Indict, which had a lot of these documents there. No one did anything about it. And as someone who's on the left, I think it's pretty shameful that the left itself really didn't talk about that. They talked about the sanctions as they should have, but they didn't talk about the fact that Saddam is said to have killed about 15% of the Iraqi population. About 3 million people. So if you take the kind of median population that existed in Iraq between 1968 and 2003, at the time the Ba'ath Party ruled Iraq, that's not really an exaggeration, and they're still discovering mass graves in Iraq to this day. So, but let's be clear that the way in which Saddam was removed quickly, I would argue, should have been via international law, through the International Criminal Court, much in the way that Slobodan Milosevic was treated after the war crimes he committed in the Balkans, and that the United States project was never to bring democracy to Iraq. It was really part of the Washington Consensus and a neoliberal model, which in effect wanted to eliminate one of the weak chains in the anti-Israeli front. So I would argue that what was really going on was that getting rid of Iraq was intended to intimidate Iran, intimidate neighboring Syria, get rid of one of the main so-called frontline states that was against Israel. But more than that, I think there was this feeling that there had been structural adjustment in the former communist states of Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc. The Arab world had not kept up with that, and in a sense, what we were going to have in Iraq, democracy really meant a very technocratic government, a night watchman state in which you had technocrats running the state who really were not involved in providing any, what we would call in the United States, entitlements or social services, and it would open up the Arab world to foreign investment for multinational capitalism. So that's what I think was really going on. But when we look at the looting that the U.S. allowed in April 2003, that awful statement by then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld that during war stuff happens, I think we can immediately see that the Army, the U.S. Army, only securing the Ministries of Oil and Defense indicated what was important to the United States. Probably one of the most important or the worst decisions of American foreign policy in the history of the country since 1776, in my view, was the dissolution of Iraq's conscript army. I've interviewed many officers in that army. It was an ethnically integrated officer corps of Kurds, Shiites, and Sunnis. They hated Saddam. They'd been left to be carpet bombed in Kuwait in 1991. They were discriminated against by more specialized units in the Iraqi army, the Special Guards and the Special Republican Guards. General Eric Sencheki, who is the Secretary of Veterans Affairs today, was at the time fired because he said, contra Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, that 130,000 troops would be not enough to secure Iraq, and instead we needed about 400,000 troops. And if you look at the statistic here, there are about 385,000 members of the Iraqi conscript army, about 400,000 and 410,000, 20,000 if you include the National Police. And the fact that they were all dismissed after the war when they themselves were against Saddam could have provided security in Iraq, and that many, not because they were anti-American, but because they had families. I've had Iraqi colleagues who've done research showed that about anywhere from 6 to 10 million Iraqis were adversely affected by this. So, of course, Saddam, knowing that he was going to be defeated, he had no no system, no Air Force, no anti-aircraft batteries. He knew his army was going to be defeated, and he thought he would do something that was similar to what happened in Somalia in 1996, that he would give the United States the illusion of victory, that the United States would win, and then he would begin to attack through an insurgency American forces. They would be killed. Public opinion, the U.S. would force a withdrawal of U.S. forces, and the Ba'ath Party would come back to power. Of course, this is a pipe dream, but Saddam had buried many, many caches of weapons and money throughout the country, and so in a sense, the U.S. gave this kind of great present to the insurgency by firing all these troops and the police. Of course, they also engaged in a very silly de-Baathification policy. I have many Iraqi friends who are professors of political science. They all had to join the Ba'ath Party. They all hated that, but that was the only way you could have a job. So many technocrats were eliminated by doing this as well, and the reconstruction process was hindered as a result. A lot of people don't know that the Coalition Provisional Authority, the U.S. agency, ad hoc agency that ran Iraq from May 2003 to June 2004, eliminated agricultural subsidies, arguing that the state has no business being involved in subsidizing agriculture. Of course, we forget that in the United States we have hundreds of thousands of tons of corn and soybean rotting in silos throughout the country, which is a reflection of our own agricultural subsidies. But long story short, this made Iraqi fruits and vegetables less competitive with Iranian and Syrian imports, and hastened the movement of young farmers from rural to urban areas where they joined criminal organizations and sectarian militias, and of course fed into those groups who were attacking Iraqi forces and the newly constituted Iraqi army. So the 2003 looting undermined Iraqi trust in what the United States said it was going to do. The United States said the same thing in April and May of 2003 that the British said in March of 1917 when they arrived in Baghdad, that we're not here to dominate you, we're here to bring democracy. Of course, in both instances, it wasn't the case. The United States appointed an Iraqi governing council in 2003. It was the first time in the history of Iraq that an explicitly sectarian government was created. That sent a message to Iraqi politicians that sectarianism was the new name of the game. We created a very decentralized state by forcing Iraq to write a specific type of constitution. The reason for that was I would argue, to allow American oil companies to have access particularly to the 60% of Iraqi oil wealth, which is in the south of the country, highly good quality oil in the sense it's low sulfur content and probably the cheapest to extract of any oil in the world, about $1 a barrel. We also favored sectarian political parties rather than building on the political system by drawing upon elites who had remained in Iraq and forces that were anti-Saddam. During Saddam's reign, we brought in a lot of expatriates, like an organization called the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. This was an organization founded in Tehran in 1982 during the Iran-Iraq War, led for 2 years by Republican guards. And you have to ask yourself, what was the United States, which was neoliberal and pro-Israel, doing, bringing in an organization that is called the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq? Well, they had their own militia. They thought that they would be in control of the Shiite South because it's a Shiite organization, and that they would have access through this organization to getting contracts for American oil firms. It didn't work out, though, because American oil firms have not benefited from the invasion of Iraq, and we can talk about that a little later on. Here's just some quick images. It took a captain with a satellite phone 5 days to get American forces to come secure the Iraq Museum, which has not only Iraq's great patrimony going back thousands of years, but the world's patrimony. Here you can see 2 images of all the destruction of artifacts, and many thousands of artifacts are still unaccounted for. Here you can see that the Ministry of Oil is secured, but the Ministry of Culture was not. So all the ministries in Iraq, because of the looting the United States allowed, were destroyed down to stripping the copper wire out of the walls. So, of course, there was nowhere that state employees could go back to work once stability was rephased. So it is a kind of amazing that Iraq, having undergone 35 years of Ba'athist rule, one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century, the 1980 to 88 Iran-Iraq War, costing about $600 billion, destroying the oil sector in both countries and leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths, plus the 1991 Gulf War, a major uprising after the 1991 Gulf War, the worst sanctions regime ever imposed on any nation state by Iran between 1991 and on Iraq between 1991 and 2003, and the sectarian violence that the country experienced, again, I would argue largely because of U.S. missteps in their policy between 2000 and 2003 and 2008, that Iraq did make some steps towards democracy between 2005 and 2010. First of all, I want to challenge one of the stereotypes that we often see, that somehow there's a contradiction between Islam and democracy. I think this is a very nonsensical issue, and I would point here to Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, who's not only the leader of Iraq's Shia, but Shiism worldwide. And while I disagree with some of his perspectives, certainly, for example, on homosexuality, if you look at his fatwas, he has 4 volumes of religious decrees. His fatwas on the role of women in Islam are extremely progressive. And he was very much in the forefront of condemning sectarian violence and encouraging national reconciliation, and also forcing the government to hold elections, which I'll come back to in a little bit. He was key in forming the first major Iraqi political party, the United Iraqi Alliance, in 2004, in anticipation for the first parliamentary election. I'm sorry, there's a typo here, which were held in January 2005. So Iraq had 2 elections in 2005. One was for a transitional parliament that was in office from January 2005 to December 2005, and then an election in December of 2005 for a parliament which lasted until 2010. Sistani issued religious decrees informing Shiite women not only that they had the right to vote, but they must vote. So women were actively involved. And I think that what we see in Iraq was that moderate clerics have been key in helping build democracy. So the elections, the first ones that were held in January 2005, as you can see, there were a lot of folks that were out participating. For those who argue that Iraqi politics have to be understood in sectarian terms, that it's not really a nation state, but it's really just a group of Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds, something I'll come back to in just a minute as well. Nevertheless, initially, I would argue that the reason that Iraqis voted for their own ethnic groups is that there was no national security, and local militias were really giving them their security, and therefore these militias really influenced their voting behavior. We'll see in just a minute that that voting behavior dramatically changed in 2009 and 2010. Now, Al-Qaeda was able to assert itself in Iraq as well. Its own local affiliate was called Al-Qaeda in the Valley of Mesopotamia, and it threatened Iraqi voters that anyone who voted in the elections of either January or December 2005 would be killed. Nevertheless, the voter turnout was almost 60%, which is pretty remarkable given the fact that many peasants had to march several miles to get to a voting booth. And I've looked back at our own voting statistic. When I say our, I'm being very ethnocentric here. I'm talking about the United States. I think the last time we had 60% turnout or better was in 1968. It was 60.3% when Hubert Humphrey ran against Richard Nixon. So the Iraqi Constitution, which was written in 2004, had a lot of flaws, as I just mentioned. But one of the good things I would argue that the United States imposed in that Constitution that women had to hold at least 25% of parliamentary seats. So in every election now, 1 out of every 3 candidates has to be a woman. And here you can see especially why it was so dangerous to vote, because in Iraq, unlike in Canada and the United States, I'm sure none of you have to stick your finger in a thing of ink, which doesn't go away for at least a week. Anyone could tell that you had voted, and of course that could lead to you being executed. And you can see here that everybody, most of these are Arabs, but here we have Kurds as well. We're very pleased with the outcome of these elections. In 2009, now the situation had changed. The Iraqi government had been able to suppress a lot of militias, and once these militias were suppressed, I was in Iraq at the time interviewing people. Iraqis dumped them like hot potatoes, to use one of our colloquialisms. And in the January 2009 Arab provincial elections for provincial legislatures, Iraqi voters chose services over sectarianisms. The big loser was the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council, because the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq had now changed its name to try to appear to be a little more moderate. It was continuing, however, to manipulate religious symbols. I would argue that Iraq is actually an incredibly secular country. I've just written an article comparing the Islamist movement in Egypt with Iraq, and they're totally different animals. Secular parties were the big winner. There would have been even a higher turnout rate, but many of the voters, they used Saddam-era rationing from the 1990s, those lists. So 300,000 people weren't able to vote because people had moved from one province to another. These voting lists were based, these ration lists were based on particular provinces. And there were about 280 new parties. Some of them were bogus, a lot were not. A lot of young people getting involved. So the 2009 elections were very interesting. Now, in order to keep the Kurds, who engaged in a rebellion in, as I said, in 1991, and formed their own semi-autonomous region during this period of UN sanctions, because the U.S. created a no-fly zone in the 36th parallel, the Iraqi Constitution says today that if 3 adjacent provinces decide to hold a vote and 50% of the populace agrees, they can form a semi-autonomous region. This was done to keep the 3 Kurdish majority provinces in the north within a federal Iraq. So this Kurdish government that had been formed in the 1990s already turned out to be extremely corrupt, because if 60% of the oil is in the south of Iraq, 40% is under Kurdish control. And young Kurds didn't like this, workers, middle-class Kurds, professionals, so on and so forth. So they formed a new parliament, a party rather, in 2009 called Guran, which in Kurdish means change. That list, even though its members were attacked, many of them were fired from their government jobs, and 65% of all jobs in the Kurdish regional government, that's that semi-autonomous region in the north, are government jobs. And along with another progressive group of services and reform list, they won basically about 40% of the seats in parliament. And that's been a major step forward in fighting corruption and nepotism in the Kurdish government. And my Kurdish colleagues tell me that as a result, since 2009, even though they don't have votes to be able to enact certain laws, what they have done through creating hell in the parliament is force the Kurdish government, the KRG government, to really cut back on its but not only its authoritarianism, but its corruption. So one of the key components of developing democracy, I would argue, is checks and balances, and we see that operative there. Here we see a young Kurd who is celebrating the victory in Sulaymaniyah, which is one of the two main cities in northern Iraq. But I would like to call your attention to the logo, the poster of the Goran Party, which of course you have here Goran in Kurdish, but you have change in English, but you also have at-Taghir in Arabic. And the fact that it's in Arabic is also very interesting, because some research I'm doing now, right, is to study the ties that have been developed among Arab youth and Kurdish youth, which is a very positive development that many people aren't talking about, because they both hate their respective governments, the Arab government in Baghdad and the Kurdish government in the KRG. Many young Arabs went to the north during the sectarian violence of 2003 and 2008 with their parents. They met young Kurds. And so that's a very exciting development. It also belies this whole sectarian model of Iraq that somehow Arabs and Kurds can't get together. I'd point out that nationally 25% of the populace is Shiite and Sunni in terms of intermarriage. That statistic is as high as 40% in some major cities like Baghdad. And there's also a lot of intermarriage between Kurds and Arabs, and also Turkmen and Kurds and Arabs. So let's move on now to the next phase of democratization in Iraq, the 2010 parliament elections. Again, it's interesting that a list called the El-Araqiyya list, headed by a Shiite, a secular list, won 91 seats against the 89 seats for the current Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, which he heads a party called the Islamic Call Party. It's another one of these sectarian Islamist parties. And it's interesting, if you see right here, that he changed the name of his party before the election to the State of Law Coalition, because he could see that Iraqis didn't want to vote for parties which based their ideology or their program on sectarian symbolism. And this National Iraqi Alliance, which was the United Iraqi Alliance in 2004 and it won overwhelmingly, in 2005 elections, now dropped down to 54 seats. And the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council, which had been very powerful in 2004, 2005, only got 17 seats. And a new militia organization, which is like Hezbollah, it's called the Sadrist Movement, won the remainder of those seats. It's very interesting here to note that working together, the head of the Sunni Muslim community, the Grand Mufti, Sheikh Ahmed Abdul Ghafoor al-Samarai, and Sistani, of course, Ayatollah Sistani, prevented Maliki from postponing the elections, because he'd done polling and he could see that he was going to potentially lose, so he tried to postpone it. They said, no, 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 we have a constitution now, you can't fight the constitution, you have to have the elections. What's also interesting is that Maliki wanted to have a closed list system. Now, many of you know that a closed list system is where you don't really know who the candidates are, and all you know is that you're voting for one party or another. Well, this was a trick, because as I said before, one out of every three candidates had to be a woman. So these parties were getting their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, their girlfriends, sticking them in there, and by a closed list, they could just get women in there who were going to support the men. By having an open list system, you had women who could run as independents or as strong women, and a lot of women were elected that are not sort of subservient to male leadership of many political parties, and they formed an important women's caucus in the Iraqi parliament. So the open list system was an important thing. I wrote a book called Memories of State, Politics, History, and Collective Identity in Iraq on the Iraqi nationalist movement. I won't be able to go into that in detail, but one thing about that Iraqi nationalist movement that I think is very important, that it was cross-ethnic in nature. It included not only Sunnis and Shiites, but Kurds, very large percentage of Iraq's big Jewish community, Christians, Turkmens, Yazidis, Sabaeans, Armenians, Nestorian Christians, Assyrian Christians, the whole 9 yards. So what we see in March 2010 is a kind of reversion back to that form of voting behavior. So the Iraqiyya list is headed by a Shiite. Many Sunnis voted for it, many secular Shiites voted for it, and many Kurds voted for it. Nevertheless, the United States intervened to prevent that organization, as did Iran. So it's interesting that Iran and the United States intervened in 2010 to prevent the democratically elected victor in that election from actually becoming prime minister. The national turnout again was very impressive, at 62.4%, over 70% in the Kurdish region. The Iraqi High Electoral Commission said that the elections were fair, as did foreign observers. Maliki took the whole thing to court. They did a whole recount, huge recount. Took them a hell of a long time. The results came out exactly the same, and the court system turned down Maliki's challenge. Here are some indicators of the list, and you can see here that Maliki's list up there in the Arabic numerals 337. So you can see how many, and the Iraqiyya, which is on the other side, 333, you can see that there were a large number of political parties. Here you can see the role that women played, and I'd like to call your attention to two of the visuals here in the lower your left-hand corner. This woman here, her name is Fairuz Hatem, and she's running for that under the banner of the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council. Now you'll notice here that this indicates what I just said about Iraqis not being into sectarian symbolism. So this is a middle-class neighborhood. You can see she's wearing Western clothing, jewelry, and makeup. And people were shocked when they saw these. First of all, they were shocked that the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council had women without a hijab or a headscarf, or even posters of women to begin with. But you can see here in Sadr City, which is a very poor slum area of northeastern Baghdad, the same woman, no makeup, no jewelry, and she's wearing the hijab. So again, a lot of this discussion of sectarianism is really about political power and has nothing to do with Islam at all. So let's talk about how things happened after 2010. To use one of our U.S. colloquialisms, things began to dramatically go south. So the elite after 2010 continues to be one that suffers from intense conflict and competition. Ayad Alawi, who headed the Al-Iraqiyya, which won the 91 seats, was very resentful because by law, under the Constitution, he should have been given the first opportunity to try to form a government. Instead, with the support of the United States and Iran, he linked up with the Kurds that also won around 54 seats, and he said, well, now my 89 seats plus the Kurds' 54 seats, that gives me a majority. I should be the first one. Well, that's against the law. The United States said, no, we're gonna push that and allow that. Instead, the United States tried to create a consolation prize by suggesting that the Iraqi government create what would be equivalent to the U.S.'s National Security Council. Alawi would head that. He would be allowed to appoint the defense and interior ministers and be responsible for fighting domestic terrorism and for foreign defense policy, but that never was implemented. Maliki just said, oh, I'm going to do that, but then once Maliki was given the prime ministership again, he forgot that. So that's what's created some of the major conflicts today. And if you look at the Arabic press, I have some of the latest issues of Al-Hayat, the country is really coming apart at the seams today, and you can trace all of it back to this U.S. and Iranian decision to try to stick with Maliki. The same thing that the U.S. did in 1991, not letting Saddam be overthrown, because we didn't think that Iraq is a nation. We think that it has to have a strong dictatorial leader, otherwise it's going to fall apart and devolve into sectarian groups. Another major misconception of what are the driving factors in Iraqi politics. The Kurds initially, after 2010, said, wow, this is great. We like the fact that the Arabs are at each other's throats because then they're not going to try to mess with us, and they're not going to try to prevent us from exploiting our oil wealth here in the north. But as things began to get more and more dicey in the country, you began to see sectarian militias reemerge. You began to see terrorism, car bombings, suicide bombings, develop. They said, wait a second, maybe this isn't so good after all. So the Kurds called a big meeting in Erbil in 2010. After 7 months, no government had been formed. Maliki once again said, oh yeah, I'm going to allow Alawi to be head of this National Council for Security Affairs. He didn't, so that was just sort of pouring oil on the fire. So U.S. and U.K. forces withdrew in 2011. And the minute that happened, because the Maliki government has not at all used any of its oil wealth. And by the way, Iraq doesn't just have a lot of oil wealth. Iraq has huge wealth in natural gas. There's about 220 trillion cubic feet of reserves, and about 70% of Iraqi oil is yet to be discovered. So this is a country that's rolling in money. However, none of this is being seen at the local level at all. So militias that have reemerged, especially supported by Iran in the south, Shiite militias, have been able to do so, excuse me, because they are able to provide the services that the government is not. You also have a huge drought in Iraq. The two main rivers that comprise the famous Fertile Crescent, the Tigris and Euphrates, are drying up. There's been 2-3 years of no rainfall, and so that's only enhancing farmers leaving the countryside and going to urban areas where, of course, there are no jobs. That's only allowing criminal groups and militias to only expand their power. And these militias, as they grow, are also challenging the police forces in the south and the army. So this gridlock among the elite has only made things even worse since 2010. The Arab Spring is different, of course, in Iraq because in other countries, the young people and middle class and workers who have been fighting against, started this were not the Islamists who started the Arab Spring, or what I would prefer to call the Arab revolutions or Arab uprisings, because I think the kind of Arab Spring is a kind of liberal teleology which sort of assumes that a summer is right around the corner in which everything is going to be, to use a phrase, peace, love, and Woodstock. And I would say that that's very silly when we think about how long it's taken many countries to democratize. But the Arab Spring has encouraged Iraqis to even demand not the overthrow of their government, but that Maliki, who was elected in 2010, that he actually implement the democratic reforms that he promised to at the time. There are weekly demonstrations that are always ongoing in Baghdad, which is, of course, the capital, the Arab capital predominantly, although there are about 8 million Kurds, and actually 8 million Kurds, rather, that live in Baghdad as well. And in Suleimania, which is one of the main cities in the north, demonstrators are consistently beaten. Many have been killed and wounded. But at the same time, the Arab Spring has encouraged Iraqis to increase the number of civil society organizations in the society. There are about 6,000 registered civil society organizations. I would argue that probably only 2,000 to 3,000 of those are actually operative. The others are bogus. But the vast majority of those that do perform important services, like to female heads of households, because, of course, with all the wars and the violence in Iraq, believe it or not, Iraq's population is anywhere between 60 and 65% female. It's an incredible demographic. But youth are playing a critical role here, and they're doing a lot to try to fill that vacuum as the militias are, as these sectarian groups are, in terms of the void of government services. So I would also argue that the Arab Spring shows that Iraqis want more personal freedoms. And I don't think we should be dismissive of the fact that Iraqis want personal freedoms. They want the concept of the individual to be valorized. And I think if democracy is really going to take place in Iraq, it simply can't be one in which authority is ceded to authoritarian leaders, such as we had in Egypt under Nasser in 1952, a kind of corporatism which ultimately becomes corrupt and leads to the suppression of any form of pluralism or democratic discourse. So just to lay my cards on the table, I think that a real democratic Iraq is one that deals with social justice. And if you look at the nationalist movement, which was powerful between 1908 and 1963, when it was suppressed by the first Ba'athist government, along with the help of the CIA, it always emphasized what it called in Arabic al-qadiyya al-ijtima'iyya, which is social justice, or the social question. So what I think in Iraq has to be addressed is issues of social justice. Peasants don't want to walk 3 hours to vote if they get nothing back in return, but you also have a middle class that is prospering and also wants individual freedom. So there has to have a real democracy in the Middle East, I would argue, a democracy that addresses social justice issues, but at the same time allows for institutional development and personal freedoms of expression. Without those elements, we're not talking about democracy at all. So the most serious problem here, from a political economy perspective, is lack of jobs, substandard or non-existent government services, and massive corruptions. Iraq was number 178 out of 180 on Transparency International, that's the German NGO's list of the most corrupt countries in the world. I'm pleased to report that it's now at 175. So it's made some progress. So let's look at the public opinion. For people that argue that Iraqis don't support democracy, you can look at this poll. This poll is one of many that give you the exact same results. But pay attention to the question that was asked. It's not an abstract question. It says, making Iraq more democratic will likely improve services and our quality of life. That's what Iraqis want. They don't want an abstract notion of being able to vote periodically in fair and transparent elections. They certainly want that, but they want to see some kind of results. And that's even among the Sunni population, which is supposedly resentful of the new order after Saddam, you see high support for democratization. And here, and someone mentioned the James Carville approach to American politics, it's the economy stupid, I think it was Ritica. I mean, it's the economy stupid, it's jobs and unemployment. Sectarianism is not a big issue for Iraqis here. They're worried about jobs, 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 and after that, more jobs. So if we're going to look at this from a theoretical perspective, a theory of democratic transitions, from a citizen's perspective, we can argue that Iraq appears well placed to make a transition to democracy using the following indicators, which can be quantified: voter turnout, political participation, and public opinion polls. We could also take participation in civil society organizations as another indicator as well. And we look at voting patterns from 2005 to 2010 that suggests that support for sectarianism is on the decline. However, from an elite perspective, it's a totally different issue, and that's why I titled this section of my talk, The Fish Rots from the Head Down, because the elites are corrupt and they have no interest whatsoever in imposing or developing a democratic system. So let's talk about the current crisis, and I'd like to end with a few thoughts on democratic transitions theory, and I'll shut up. So Maliki's undermining democratization. Since 2010, what has he done? He's taken over the Independent High Electoral Commission. So that's history. He's also taken over the control of the central bank, which means he controls all the money. He's also threatened judges because he was furious that they overturned his challenge to the voting results in 2010. And we've even seen judges been killed. And I think worst of all, he's done what Saddam did during the 1970s before he seized the presidency in 1979 officially. He put all his own people in major slots in the security services and the army. So Maliki's doing the same thing. So you have increasingly secret service organizations and military units whose commanders are only loyal to Maliki. So just to give you one example, there's a parliamentarian called Sabah al-Saadi. He called Maliki a dictator. He was threatened with 7 years imprisonment. Luckily, the parliament didn't lift his immunity, so he couldn't be brought to trial. Iraq also abstained on the Arab League vote condemning Syria for its attack on its own citizens because Maliki was in exile for many years in Syria and because Maliki is very closely tied to Iran. And those who speak about American imperialism, and I certainly say that there is something called American imperialism, but there's a difference between wanting to be an imperialist and being able to implement it. Because if oil and controlling of Iraq were our, meaning the United States, outcomes, we neither control Iraq today. Iran is the most powerful. You know, remember Bush's speech on the axis of evil. Who are the axis of evil? Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Well, Iran is the most powerful country in Iraq today, and U.S. oil companies are far behind many other major oil companies in getting access to energy in Iraq. So Iran has pressured Maliki, and Maliki doesn't want to trash the Syrians because the Syrians, of course, are the allies of Iran and by extension, Hezbollah, the major organization among the Shia in southern Lebanon. But Maliki's actions show certainly a lack of respect for the rule of law. Now, I want to quickly go through this because I only have a few more minutes, but after Gaddafi was overthrown or his government fell, he was killed in October, but it was in August of 2011, the National Transitional Council Prime Minister found that many Baathists had gone to Libya and were trying to enlist Gaddafi to help them bring about a coup to bring the Ba'ath Party back to power. This was like, you know, Charlie Chaplin-esque. This never had any real meaning, but Maliki used this to dismiss a lot of Sunnis that he didn't like and who he saw as competitors from positions of power. The Sunni Arabs were furious at that. They said that he was using this as really a means to get rid of them. Maliki said no, he was protecting Iraq's security. The truth is that he was really using this as a manner to really strengthen his base among sectarian Shiites and to get rid of any Shiites that or Sunnis rather, that he saw as competitors. Next thing that he did, just as U.S. forces were withdrawing in December 2011, is attack one of his vice presidents. Now, Iraq has 3 vice presidents. One is Sunni, one is Shiite, and one is Kurds. That's kind of a remnant of the U.S. policy in 2003 and 2004. Now, there have been claims that Tariq al-Hashimi, who is the former head of the Iraqi Islamic Party and an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, actually been running a terrorist ring, and these charges go back to 2006, 2007. Most Iraqis think they're bogus. So what Maliki did was arrest his bodyguard, torture them, and force them to say, yes, indeed, Hashimi was involved in terrorism. Now, Hashimi's Iraqi Islamic Party was part of the Iraqi coalition. Once he was accused of this, they withdrew from the government, and that's when all the real troubles began, which are leading now to perhaps a reversion or Iraq degenerating into a civil war. But again, just to come back to the whole notion of sectarianism, let's look at Hashimi and let's compare him to another major Sunni politician, the Speaker of the Parliament, Osama Najafi. Anybody who's a political scientist knows what the impact of institutions can be. So let's talk a little bit, if we can, for a moment about Najafi. And Najafi comes from the northern Arab city of Mosul, which is just on the border, so-called Green Line, between the northern Arab areas and the Kurdish areas. And it's known historically for having been strongly Arab nationalist or pan-Arab nationalist and strongly supportive of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party. When Najafi lived there, he was the head of a party called the Hadbat Party. The Hadbat is a mosque in Mosul which has, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, a minaret that leans. And he couldn't have been a more racist, sectarian person you'd ever want to meet. He was constantly trashing the Shia and the Kurds. The minute he was appointed Speaker of the Parliament, suddenly, who were his best buddies? The Shiites and the Kurds. Of course, they make up the majority of, and today the Shiites and the Kurds think he's the best thing that has happened to the parliament since motherhood and apple pie. So Najafi, once the Iraqiyya withdrew from Maliki, from its ministers from Maliki's government, he started a splinter movement of the Iraqiyya called White Iraqiyya. So what I'm trying to get at here, without boring you with a lot of details, is to show that within the Sunni community, there are tremendous cleavages. And I would basically make the argument that the main cleavages in Iraq today are within, not among, these 3 major ethnic groups, the Kurds, the Goran against the KRG leadership, El-Iraqiyya, tribal groups, and the White Iraqiyya within the Sunni movement, within the Shiite movement, we'll just see in a minute, very large cleavages as well. But in any event, which further inflamed things is that on September 9th of last year, Maliki was sentenced in absentia to death because he fled the country when he was accused of being killed. So Maliki now is being challenged because of no services by the Sudras movement, these big militia movement in the south, and another group called the League of the Righteous People. But the Sudras and the League of the Righteous People are violent enemies because they're trying to gain control of the poor Shia. So Maliki is fighting these 2 militia organizations. He's also fighting a member of his own party who splintered off from his party. And he's also fighting with the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council and its form of militia, which is split off from the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council. Now, if this is driving you crazy, I can understand, because it's even hard for Iraqis to keep up with all these splinters. So what I'm saying here is that the conflicts are more intra-ethnic than they are inter-ethnic. The U.S. is going to still keep a lot of influence in Iraq, so when we're talking about the Arab Spring and are we going to see any real kind of transformation, I think we have to take into account that there are 2 impediments to this transformation. One is neighborhood effects, because neither Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, or Kuwait or Jordan, Iraq's neighbors, wants to see a democratic Iraq. And the United States itself, for all its discussion, even under the Obama administration, of supporting democracy, really is much more interested in Iraq's oil potential and its strategic potential, being a neighbor of Iran, which of course we know is trying to develop nuclear weapons. But I try to list here, and I won't go over all the things here, that the U.S. is going to continue, especially because it's building the Iraqi Air Force and the Iraqi Navy, continue to maintain strong influence in Iraq for a long period of time. And Maliki, of course, wants to balance the U.S. against Iran. Now, why is Maliki favoring Iran? First of all, Iran is very powerful. You have a huge drug problem in southern Iraq. I thought it was kind of hashish, but it's actually cocaine and more recently ecstasy. You have about 25% of poor youth in the south that are addicted to drugs. So not only is Iran exporting a lot of drugs to southern Iraq, but it's got its militias there. And if Maliki doesn't make nice with the Iranians, he's going to find himself in deep trouble. Maliki is also using Iran to intimidate the KRG because rebels who support Iran's Kurdish population are operating outside the KRG. Iranian forces are attacking the KRG, and Maliki won't come to their help because they won't toe his line in terms of oil policies. So, and Maliki's also trying to play off these militias. And Maliki also is earning a lot of money because there's a huge pilgrimage trade of Iranian Shia who come to Iraq to holy shrines in the shrine cities of Najaf, Karbala, and the Qadimain district of Baghdad. So for a whole variety of reasons, Iran is important economically. It provides a lot of consumer goods, and we hear a lot about how our electricity doesn't function in Iraq, but the one area which it does function is in eastern Iraq, along the Iranian-Iraq border, because Iran has built that entire electoral grid. Now there's an effort to depose Maliki in the parliament because they're furious over all the things that I've just talked about. The Sunnis in their three provinces of Anbar, Nineveh, and Salahuddin are trying to do what the Kurds did to form their own autonomous region. And the Shiites in the south around Basra, where Professor al-Nasri originally comes from, are trying to form their own autonomous region. And while they are absolutely allowed to do that, and Maliki has to respond to any demand to hold a referendum on that within 2 weeks, he's refused to do that because he's worried about losing more power. So all the political elites are fearful that Maliki is acquiring too much power. He fears that they will trample on their interests. They've called for a vote of no confidence. And if this resolution were to pass, Maliki would be required to call new parliamentary elections. However, the vote of no confidence has to be approved by Iraq's president, who is a Kurd, by the way. He's in a hospital right now, and even though he's recovering, even if he did recover, he wouldn't sign that. So the parliament's not able to do what it tends to do. So the opposition now is really linked primarily to this huge militia of Sadrists because they control 40 votes in the parliament, and they are the kind of kingmakers. And even though they're Shiites and Maliki Shiites, they're trying to force Maliki to accept term limits, to say that he's going to use Iraqi's oil wealth to actually provide services, and unless he does that, they're going to support the vote of no confidence. The parliament has already prevented Maliki from stacking Iraqi High Election Commission with his own cronies, even though he's in effect taken it over. Women have boycotted the parliament because he won't appoint any women to that. While he has forced the central bank director to resign, the parliament won't approve his new director because he won't consult them. So even though we can't argue that there's democracy in Iraq, I think that those people that argue that Iraqi democracy is non-existent, we have to take into account that the parliament is trying to do things that are democratic. And what's most important in terms of that parliament is that groups from different parts of the country and different sects are having the opportunity to interact on a daily basis. And while that's not creating a great form of love and brotherhood or sisterhood among all of them, it is allowing them to see that they can negotiate with one another. So a lot is happening in the parliament that on the surface doesn't look particularly promising from the passage of laws, but if you study what's going on informally, there's a lot of important democratic impulses happening nonetheless. So could Iraq fragment due to this elite crisis, and especially now, and I'll end up with that in just a few minutes, to fragment into 3 mini-states, what many analysts in the West would argue? Of course it's going to fragment because it's an artificial nation state. It's really just an aggregation of 3 different ethnic groups. Especially when we consider that the Sunnis have asked for an autonomous region, the Shiites in the far south of the country. And why do they do that? Because that's where most of the oil is located, and they don't like Maliki not consulting them on how that oil wealth is disposed. And of course, the Kurdish regional government, now the U.S. has left, it's very nervous about remaining part of Iraq. And what it's doing is developing stronger ties with Turkey, developing pipelines to Turkey, and Turkey has about $6.5 billion invested in Iraq. So there are some incentives for this fragmentation to take place. However, I would argue that that's not going to happen. The Kurds don't want to trade their dependency on the Arab South for dependency on the Turks, because the Turks are much more strong military and economically. The Sunnis, even if they did form a semi-autonomous region, are not going to be able to change their situation very much. And the people in the far south, the Shiites, really don't want, most of the Shiites don't really want to form a semi-autonomous region because, again, they don't see how that's going to allow them to really change the power dynamic. I think most Iraqis feel that change is going to come by through national coalitions that are going to force Maliki to change his tune. So the Syrian crisis next door has also influenced and reignited sectarian tensions in Iraq. Some Shiite militia members have gone to support the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which is an offshoot of Shiism. And some Sunni tribesmen in the so-called Sunni Arab Triangle, which is in the north-central part of Iraq, have gone to support the Free Syrian Army, which is primarily made up of Sunnis. And as Sunni Kurds are fighting in the northeast of Syria to develop an autonomous, if not independent, Kurdish state, they have been given training by Iraqi Kurds in the Kurdish regional government. And here's what a Kurdish state, if it were able to be established, would look like. I would argue that that's not going to happen because the Kurds are very divided. The Kurds, for example, in Turkey and Syria use a Cyrillic or Latin alphabet, and the Kurds in Iraq and Afghanistan and Iraq use a Arabo-Persian. And even though some Kurds have argued, because there's this very, very small minority of Kurds in Iraq who are sectarian in the sense that they're against the Arabs, and they have reasons to be because, remember, Saddam Hussein gassed one of their major cities in 1988, Halabja, and destroyed about 175 villages along the so-called Kurdish villages along the so-called Green Line between the Arabs and the Kurds, effectively destroying the Kurds' agrarian system. When these sectarian Kurds said, let's change our alphabet from the Arabo-Persian to a Latin script, even those Kurds who support eventually independence were horrified. They said, our whole history is based in poetry. And we're going to do the same thing that Ataturk did to Turkey, shoot ourselves in the foot, because our young people are going to have no access to our heritage, to our literature, to our history, because once you change the alphabet, they won't be able to read about their past. So again, I only have a couple more slides here. So the UN, as it's seen things get worse and worse, has sent a special envoy, Martin Kobler, to Iraq. So I think this is indicative of how dangerous people see the situation. And really what only accentuated the actions against Vice President Tariq al-Hashemi was the arrest of the security detail of the Sunni Minister of Finance, Rafi al-Asawi. Now, Rafi al-Asawi is this incredible moderate guy, highly well-educated, not sectarian in the least, and there's no reason whatsoever that he should have been attacked. This led to riots breaking out in Anbar province. The Sunni community en masse, like literally hundreds of thousands of them, trying to march down the highway to Baghdad to hold a big Friday prayer service, because that's a traditional kind of mechanism. You see that in the Arab Spring. A lot of the demonstrations take place on Fridays after the Friday prayer. The Iraqi army, using, again, Shiite commanders, blocked the road, and so that's where situations exist at the moment. But what's very interesting is that the Sunnis, despite their anger, have not resorted to violence. They're resorting to demonstrations. They're going to court. They're trying to get international public opinion involved, the UN involved. So I think this is an indication that things have changed since the time of Saddam in 2003. The new effort to impose term limits on the Prime Minister and the Vice Presidents and the Speaker of Parliament is an effort to prevent Maliki from running for Prime Minister again in 2014. And the fact that the Parliament, which never can even get a quorum, can't even get a quorum. Usually I only have about 130 out of 325 parliamentary members actually in Parliament. was able to get 170 votes calling on term limits. The problem is that Maliki controls the judiciary, so the Supreme Court is going to rule this effort to impose term limits is against the Constitution. Maliki has done some things like release a lot of Sunni prisoners, especially women, whose husbands, either for valid or invalid reasons, were imprisoned. And that's horrible because some of these women have been attacked and raped in jail. But again, I think the parliament here is one of the main barriers, and the demonstrations to Maliki really imposing himself as a neo-Saddam. So the worst case scenario in Iraq is continued political paralysis, based on elite conflict, corruption, and lack of services. Iran is involved. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf states are supporting radical Islamists in the north. Armed militias are challenging the government's authority in the south. And I think something no one talks about, and again, this all speaks to the issue of imperialism, political instability disrupts foreign investment. Yes, ExxonMobil did get one large contract in the south of Iraq, but if you talk to the people who are trying to explore for oil, every time they go out in the morning into the desert, they're stopped by this tribe or this criminal group for bribes, and they can't get anything done. So this political instability is dampening any desire by foreign energy companies, whether it's for natural gas or oil, to invest in the country. So the oil industry, which collapsed during the 1990s and has to be modernized if it's going to increase its output, is not going anywhere because there's no one there to help them do this. And we could perhaps have the KRG declare de facto or even de jure independence, but I don't think that's going to happen. So just to summarize, I think Iraqi democracy is at a crucial turning point. If Maliki can't be forced to promote national reconciliation, it is conceivable that there could be fragmentation. And here I would argue that the U.S., the European Union, the UN, and Turkey are key actors in ensuring that Iraq does not fragment, although Obama seems to be really taking a very hands-off approach on Iraq, as is the European Union. Further instability in Iraq would have negative consequences for an already shaky global economy, and that instability only favors Iranian expansion and expanded influence in Iraq. So I think that we're talking about Iraqi democratization. We should not consider Iraqi democratization a spectator sport. It's not like we're sitting here in Canada or in the United States or Europe or other Arab countries watching two soccer teams, the authoritarians and the Democrats, fighting it out in Iraq. They need support, and I think we can do that, especially since many of us are academics and writers and intellectuals in trying to promote that cause through our own writing and democratic activism. Economic issues are still the key variable. Zogby poll in 2011 found in all Arab countries, Iraq as well, that the main concern of respondents was expanding economic opportunity. I think that should take us away from the idea that Islam is the dominant element in the Arab Spring. But Maliki's actions are stifling economic growth, promoting criminal groups and militias, and enhancing the power of Iran and radical Sunnis. So in that sense, our prospects aren't very positive in terms of what we might see and predict in the future. And for my last slide, I'd like to just say that I think what has not been emphasized, either in the books that I'm using in a seminar I'm teaching on the Arab Spring right now, or in the media for that matter, is what I would call the political economy of the Arab Spring. Yes, there are references to youth unemployment, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. Iraqis, as other Arabs, associate democracy, what I would call local democracy, with social justice. We also need to see that the Arab Spring can't be understood as an aggregate of independent nation states, that this has to be part of a larger picture in which what I call neighborhood effects are having a very detrimental impact. If we do a comparison with Spain in 1975 that made a transition to democracy, we see that many Spaniards, because of a bad economy, have been forced to go to Italy, Germany, and France during the 60s and 70s, and when Franco died in 75 and they came back, they'd already seen the benefits of democracy, had started organizing labor unions, civil society organizations, and there was a lot of pressure on the authoritarians who wanted to continue Franco's legacy to keep that, but instead they were forced to make this transition to democracy, even though it's still an incomplete transition. In Iraq, there's no neighborhood effects that are positive whatsoever, and certainly the United States is not helping that as well. So I would say as a final comment here that theories of democratic transitions need to focus on political economy. They also have to need to focus on cultural variables, trust networks. Saddam did everything he could, especially in the 1990s, to set ethnic groups and regional groups against one another, generations against one another, men against women. All the rights that he gave women in the 1970s and 80s were taken away from them in the 1990s. And also institutional development. The reason that Maliki can get away with what he can get away with is there are no strong institutional constraints. Luckily, the parliament does have some institutional power, and it's only that I would argue as a final comment has prevented Iraq from really reverting to a new authoritarian state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. Kevin, we'd love to hear from you.
I don't want to. Is that okay as far as the microphone? Or is it too close? Or sure, that's good. Okay, I want to begin by thanking Professor Sabah Al-Nasseri and the other organizers for inviting me, and also for creating the title of the conference, "The Arab Revolutions." I think that's the best way of referring to these events. My presentation is entitled Iran 2009 and the Arab Revolutions, Identities and Differences. Okay, first part is called 2011 as a World Historical Moment. According to my friend, the Brazilian Marxist humanist writer Paulo Morel, the outbreak of the Arab Revolution signaled nothing less than the fact that, as he put it, the point of reversal of the long night of neoliberal hegemony, of the global dictatorship of unrestrained capitalism, is in sight. Now, he wrote that about a week after Mubarak's overthrow. Written in the heat of the moment, Morel surely exaggerated, but I still think we could say that if not in actuality, certainly in ideology and culture, the hegemony of neoliberalism has suffered serious blows from the Arab revolutions. Just to think about where we were, like, say, 20 years ago, when I was getting ready to publish my Lenin book, I found this wonderfully awful article by Richard Rorty, who wrote, in kind of summing up where radical thought was. This is in 1992. He said, well, you know, we don't need any more of these large theoretical ways of understanding the world, from Plato to Marx, and really some fusion of Habermas and Foucault is kind of what we need. And this is a line I still remember that, you know, a lot of my leftist friends won't like to hear this said, but it's the truth. We need people like Donald Trump to create wealth. I mean, you'd have to put that right up there with Bernard Lewis's prediction that American troops would be cheered as if they reached Baghdad. So I think we'll all agree that 2011 will go down in history as a revolutionary year, as important as 1848 or 1968. And not a full social revolution, of course, because a lot of my Marxist friends have emailed me and said you shouldn't use that term. But political revolution, why can't we say, you know, political revolution? And not always fully successful even as political revolutions, but nonetheless, I think we'd have to call it a world historical set of events, as Hegel liked to say. I mean, as you all know, impacting an entire region, Tunisia, then Egypt, then Bahrain, then Libya, Yemen, and Syria, and still unfolding more than 2 years later. And with, as we know, also important, and these are only the most important, most forceful echoes around the world, Spain's youth movement, the Occupy Wall Street, Israel's youth protests. Now, those all expressed explicit affinity. Now, others expressed some affinity, but not maybe direct inspiration. Wisconsin, Greece, which had been, you know, going before then, but I think got a second win. Quebec, possibly. and still others with some common features. The London riots of September 2011 didn't have an explicitly political agenda, but nonetheless happened in the context of that revolutionary year, 2011. So, okay, part two, the Arab revolutions of 2011 and since, just a few brief reflections. What is distinctive about them in a positive sense, especially where they have reached a political revolution, as in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, where at least the old state or part of it was overthrown, as opposed to stalemate or defeat, as in Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen? Well, first of all, I mean, very obviously, broad democratic aims for democracy and human rights as a global universal. I mean, think of all the discussion of the last 20 years that, whether from the right or the left, that Arab and Muslim cultures have this radical difference with the rest of the world, and therefore these notions of human rights and democracy don't apply in the same way. I think that was blown away. That whole discussion was blown away by the Arab revolutions. But secondly, and I think very new, in economic and labor dimensions, demands and certainly slogans that attack predatory neoliberal capitalism, unemployment, drawing from the very beginning, if not beginning with the poor and the working classes, as we saw, for instance, in Tunisia, but even in Syria, where those demands haven't been articulated as forcefully. Where the revolution began was in the poorest and most economically deprived areas of the country. Now, I think this more than anything, this aspect more than anything related to the Arab revolutions has helped to end the long night of neoliberal hegemony, but I'm not talking about in fact, obviously, but in terms of its ideological hegemony, or at least call it into question. Now, a third factor that everyone comments on is the youthful leadership that uses the internet in order to bypass censorship. And while we shouldn't exaggerate the importance of that, and my student Greg Burris has a wonderful article called Lawrence of Arabia, kind of satirizing and debunking the idea that these were internet revolutions. Nonetheless, certain elements of the youth have been able to use the internet effectively to communicate with each other and with the outside world. Fourthly, not led by Islamists and not with Islamist demands. Even in countries and situations where Islamist groups have had important electoral victories afterwards. In this sense, another type of long night is over. And I wrote this in an article in 2011, again, probably pretty too optimistically, but in the heat of the moment, I think this was March 2011, the long night of the past 3 decades in which two oppressive and false alternatives battled for hegemony in the Middle East and parts of the broader Muslim world. And these alternatives were pro-imperialist and nominally secular authoritarianism, Egypt and Tunisia on the one hand, and then radical fundamentalism, Iran, or even at its most extreme, the Al-Qaeda movements and those that fed into it. These two fed on each other because the Mubaraks would say, well, if not us, then you're going to get a group like the Islamic group of Egypt that tried to assassinate our Nobel Prize-winning writer, or the Algerian Islamic group that was going around at one point shooting women wearing blue jeans. And so I would argue that the radical Islamists, I'm talking now particularly of the type that we had in the 1990s in Egypt and Algeria, they actually prolonged the life of these moribund systems that we had in Egypt, and frankly the Algerian one is still in power, partly because of what they went through in the 1990s. Okay, third part, the Iranian upheaval of 2009, identities and differences with the Arab revolutions. What then of Iran 2009 when, from June 2009 until really December of that year, you had millions taking to the streets. At one point it was said that 3 million came out onto the streets of Tehran. It was certainly the most serious challenge to the Islamic Republic since its birth. And also, it was very early in the global economic crisis. I was at a conference here at that time, I think in 2010, and it was pointed out that the Iranian democratic Hebrew was the largest mass democratic movement anywhere in the world that had happened since the collapse, since the Great Recession. Now, it nearly became a second Iranian revolution, but it didn't. And so I think we have to look at why it didn't also. And so I want to make a few remarks about the Iranian upheaval, comparing and contrasting it to the Arab revolutions. Let's start with the similarities. Broadly democratic. They didn't specifically say democracy, but they said they wanted serious reforms. I mean, certainly the slogans talked about serious reforms of the Islamic Republic that would have been democratizing. It was youthful. They certainly used the internet. They were the first mass uprising to use Twitter specifically to bypass the censorship. They bravely withstood beatings, torture, etc., on a mass scale, coming back month after month. And a new generation of activists was formed. And just as in Egypt a few months before, there were people who, I think the New York Times went to both, Le Monde went to Egypt and reported in November that people are very apathetic and there seems no hope of political change. That was like November 2010. The New York Times was in Iran in late 2008 or 2009 and said, the young people are totally apathetic and apolitical. They're just into pleasure and their individual lifestyles and so forth. But as Hegel also tells us, wherever there's identity, there's also difference. And of course, if you know Hegel's logic, you go from identity to difference and then to contradiction. Now, the postmodernists aren't satisfied with that because they say ultimately there's some kind of identity lurking beneath the surface. And but that's not entirely a bad thing, that there would be commonalities among all the peoples and situations in the world. Okay, but what are some differences that show some limitations of the Iranian upheaval? While certainly drawing support from the poor and the working classes, I mean, I think the notions that Ahmadinejad had a lot of support among the working class and the rural are ludicrous. Nonetheless, the demands of the movement were at best political only, did not specifically address economic oppression, exploitation, social justice, these kinds of issues. How could they have done so when part of its leadership included wealthy state-connected families like the Rafsanjanis, possibly the wealthiest and most corrupt family in Iran? And that's saying a lot, because there's a lot of corrupt families in Iran. And then, I mean, he's a very brave man, Mehdi Karoubi, who exposed the torture and also broke taboos in terms of discussing male rape that had gone on as part of the torture in the prisons. And I certainly salute his courage and his democratic commitments. Nonetheless, in one interview, he said when the upheaval was at its height in the summer of 2009, he said, "I don't believe in strikes because strikes disrupt society." Well, okay. So at best, what we had, if we want to talk about the dominant ideologies of this movement, similar to the color revolutions of the 2000s, Serbia, Ukraine, Lebanon, that wanted democracy but did not touch issues of social justice, economic inequality. Okay, but I think there's a second thing about Iran that's even more distinctive, because that Iran did go through a major revolution in 78, 79, and it wasn't only a political revolution, it was to some extent a social revolution. The Iranian movement specifically called for changes within the system, not for the rulers to go to, or to get out, as the Arab revolutions did from the beginning. Now, of course, in Iran, if you say that, especially if you say down with Khamenei, you're committing blasphemy. You're rebelling against God, since he's God's direct representative on earth. But nonetheless, that wasn't, for whatever reason, those who would have said that until really the end, December 2009, the movement kind of stuck to the very limited slogans about reform of the system, where's my vote, this kind of thing, all through 2009. Now, part of this is just tactical. They thought there was a certain amount of political space that they could operate within. But there's something else also, because the Western press would interview these youth who would come back from like battling the Basiji police, and they'd be bloody from the conflict and say, you know, I'm going to go back. I don't care if I die tomorrow, whatever. And then they'd say, but one thing I want to make clear is we don't want a revolution. There was a common thread that said over and over again among the youth and the intellectuals of Iran, including the fairly radical ones. This too is linked to the outcome of the 1979 revolution. Just made the word revolution carry such a bad taste. People would say, what revolutions do is you end up with a bunch of fanatics taking over. That what we need is democracy and civil society. So the Iranian revolution, the Iranian upheaval of 2009 is ideologically still a prisoner to some extent of that discussion of democracy and civil society that we had that was so dominant in the 90s when Marxism had supposedly died, as Richard Rorty was reflecting. And yet at the same time, I think there is a link. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to say that the Iranian upheaval inspired the Arab Spring. I think the cultural differences and barriers between Persians and Arabs are just very, very great. But I would say there's probably one connection in that Ahmadinejad was a fairly popular figure in the Arab world because of his statements about Israel and the United States, defiance of Israel and the United States, and we still see in Latin America that he's fairly popular. But day after day, seeing the Basiji beating to a pulp these demonstrators on the streets, I think you could argue that possibly to the new generation in the Arab world, it discredited Islamist authoritarianism. It possibly did that. Okay, so, but I've been kind of beating up a little bit on the Iranian movement. Now I want to go in the other direction and point to some features that show a more advanced character in some ways than the Arab revolutions, and particularly on gender. Okay, I don't think even in Greece, any Western country that I know of, did you see such prominent participation of women in large-scale street confrontations with the state. I don't know if in history we've ever seen this. I mean, there's this iconic New York Times photo that they put on page 1 where 3 or 4 Basiji have these clubs, and this guy is down and they're beating on him, and there's a middle-aged woman with her chador, and she's running, but she's not running away. She is running toward this group to throw her body in to try to stop this guy from being beaten up. There are these stories, I mean, I don't know quite how that would be said in Persian, but, you know, of young women saying, come on, let's go back out onto the streets, and aren't there any, like, men here? You know, playing that kind of using that kind of a rhetoric. And of course, there had been an ongoing women's movement that preceded this. There was the Million Signatures campaign from a few years earlier. There were networks of women. There were even meetings that took place in people's homes, because there had been Islamist women, including some high up in the leadership of the Green Movement, that in their earlier days had persecuted the more secular feminists. Those feminists had held meetings in the time preceding the 2009 upheaval, where the Islamist women basically, people like Zahra Ranavard, the wife of Mousavi, basically apologized to the more secular women for the way they had acted in the early days of the revolution. So the gap between secular and religious women had receded to a great extent. And of course, a lot of the religious women, what they've been doing in Iran in recent decades, or certainly since the 90s, is creating a feminist or semi-feminist theology. Okay. Now, women were a factor certainly in the Arab revolutions, on the streets, participating alongside the men. And I want to, maybe that's a poor choice of words, alongside. I mean, the women were out there very prominently. I don't think quite as prominently, though, as in Iran. Of course, recently we've had this very interesting development in Egypt, where in the midst of all these other demonstrations that have been occurring, there have been the attempts by groups of men and women to stop sexual harassment and assaults in the middle of these demonstrations in crowds in Tahrir Square and elsewhere that are very, very interesting and need to be looked at more. Now, a second difference that Iran has is every year more books are translated into Persian than into Arabic, even though Iran is a relatively small country. Now, just about now you can't translate and publish a book that says "Down with the Islamic Republic of Iran," or, you know, but you can translate Foucault's History of Sexuality, for instance. I saw it in Iran in 2005. But actually, the French title has something like The Politics of Truth, and then History of Sexuality, Volume 1 is actually the actual. So they just, when they left the word sexuality out of the title, they just gave that like big title. When my book on Marx was translated, last year, Marx at the Margins, Ethnicity, Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Non-Western Societies, they just took that Marx at the Margins off and just had the book. It's a book on nationalism, ethnicity, and non-Western societies. And then you turn into the first page or so and you see what it's actually about. But when it's sitting in the window of a bookstore, it's not as clear. So there's there has been a much more cosmopolitan spirit among the Iranian intellectuals over the past couple of decades, with so many translations. Now, Habermas, Foucault, all that Western critical theory, philosophy stuff gets translated really regularly. But here's some more further to the left kinds of things that have gotten translated. A new edition of Capital came out, Volume 1, came out in 2007. Sold out 10,000 copies almost immediately. The regime has since forbidden it to go into a second edition. Here's some of the authors who've been translated recently and whose work gets discussed in the daily press. Now, these newspapers keep getting shut down and then new ones forming. Lukács, Dunayevskaya, Bronner, Hegel, Foucault, etc. When Hegel's Phenomenology was translated in 2005, there was a huge fight in this newspaper that's since been shut down and then reopened, Sharg, about whether the translation was any good. And this was like a newspaper that circulated several 100,000 copies. It was the one that all the intellectuals pretty much read. So, as Lenin famously said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And of course, being part of the 60s generation, we had the domination of Maoists and Che Guevara, so we all rejected that. Debray specifically said that was untrue in his book, The Revolution and the Revolution. But I think it was a decent point. But then it's also a question of what kind of theory, and I don't want to exaggerate the influence of this more left-wing Marxist type of theory and so on, because when Habermas came to Iran in the early, when Khatami was still president, I think it was around 2003, something like that, I think 10,000 people showed up to hear Habermas. And then later on, after the 2009 movement, when they were starting to have the trials, it turned out that the people who invited Habermas, that Habermas basically came to Iran with the instructions to start this, anti-revolutionary CIA, Mossad type plot that we saw in these 2009 upheavals. But as a whole, I think we could say that the notions of civil society and democracy in more of a Habermasian vein, coupled with that revulsion and worry about any kind of revolution, dominate even some of the more radical elements of the opposition in Iran, certainly among youth and intellectuals. So as a whole, I think we could say that the Arab revolutions went deeper, mobilized more sectors of society, and did so in a manner that called for the direct overthrow of the rulers. And this is part of why they succeeded, at least partially, that they remain ongoing, and possibly related to why Iran remains at an impasse. Finally, what next? Just a few remarks. Okay, in terms of the Arab revolutions, pretty obviously we have deep contradictions involving Islamist agendas, imperialist intervention, or at least influence, gender, unemployment, persistence of neoliberal agendas from the Muslim Brotherhood, as was mentioned earlier. The military and security apparatus often remaining, well, certainly not in Libya, but which has its whole set of other problems, but military and security apparatus remaining to a great extent intact, as in Tunisia and Egypt. But full social revolution, or at least the flavor of that, the taste of that, remains on the agenda, as we can see in these unending protests against the new order in formation, especially in Tunisia and Egypt. And of course, the question that those people have is how to move from a partially successful political revolution to a full social revolution. Now, how would one go about that, and what are some thoughts about that? And that's my conclusion. First of all, recognize the scope of the problem, of the limits of reforms. I mean, certainly the most obvious one is, Tunisia, a year after the revolution, almost 2 years after the revolution, unemployment, I think, was 13%. Now it's about 18%. Now, as Marx wrote, and this is not the Marx that was fully a revolutionary yet, but still, this early 1843, it is not the radical revolution, not the general human emancipation, which is a utopian dream, in other words, an unrealistic dream. Rather, it is the partial, the merely political revolution, the revolution which leaves the pillars of the house standing. So that's the Marx, just as he had discovered the working class, very, very early, though. Secondly, the problem of vision. A great political theorist, I went to a conference at UCLA 2 weeks ago around this, and very radical political theorist, Tracy Strong. His newest book is called Politics Without Vision. Now, I would argue that visions are necessary, whether slightly utopian or more real in the sense of a Marxian vision. Some kind of vision of a really new human society really is necessary. Not just anger, not just expose of capitalism. Now, it's a very hard thing to do today, especially since 1989 and the hegemony, even earlier than that, of the notions like there is no alternative. And it's not only the problem that Iran faces, but in other words, the Stalinist forms of so-called socialism, the slightly left-wing, sometimes military left-wing national populism. I mean, sure, these people like Qasem in Iraq or Nasser were a hell of a lot better than the crop of leaders that the region's had recently, but nonetheless, their politics and social programs had their limitations as well. And most very obviously, the Russian or Chinese forms. And then there has to be a real taking stock of what the real social forces are, both those of us analyzing and those of us participating on the ground. I think people on the left spend a lot of their time analyzing objective forces, state structures, the economy. Remember, after the Iranian upheaval, people were saying, turned out to be wrong, but it was an interesting thesis, that Ahmadinejad represented a new generation of leadership, that he was rooted in the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a military apparatus. It's actually stronger than the army, and that he ran that. He was kind of representing that, and they were going to push aside the religious ayatollahs. We now know that the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps was in such conflict with Ahmadinejad during the suppression of the upheaval that at a meeting with a bunch of other people, he slapped him in the face. And of course, in Iran, the president is a little bit like a token figure. You can do that. There's probably a number of people who could slap the president in the face because he's more of like a flunky. I think, though, we need to look at the subjective forces or human agencies, a lot of people, and really do a serious, rigorous analysis of that. The real social forces, and in their creative development since 2011, because the workshop of revolution, of upheaval, this is a great school of self-consciousness. So to look at that and look at the real social contradictions standing in the way of a truly emancipatory revolutionary movement in the Arab world and everywhere. And I just want to end on one point, which is that I'm not a revolution or nothing type person. I'm very much in favor of raising the minimum wage in the United States right now, which is like, it's lower than it was actually in real dollars than it was when I was young. But why can't, but I think at the same time, and this is a global problem, it used to be that the people that fought for the minimum wage said this is a step on the way toward a broader set of social changes that would be revolutionary. We want to transform and destroy capitalism and substitute it with a new human system. And yes, we have these immediate, but these are linked to that broader vision and that broader strategy. So I think we need to get back to that kind of thing. And it's not easy because it has to be a real critique in the sense of the various experiments in attempts to transcend capitalism that the 20th century was so rich with. And I think that's a real, that weighs down on the living. That's a nightmare that weighs down on the living. I think a great revolutionary thinker talked about that in one of his books. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in thanking our guests for coming here today and speaking with us and offering us their illuminating remarks. Thank you. Unfortunately, due to certain temporal constraints, we're going to have to forego the question and answer period for today. However, you will have an opportunity to address the speakers tomorrow throughout the panels. But we will actually have an opportunity to listen to our musical guests. So again, thank you all for coming and enjoy the musical show.
We will play for you a few minutes, short minutes, avaz, which is vocal improvisation with the instrument kamanche, in the mode called Iraq, which means Iraq. in the spirit of supporting what was spoken of before, and dedicated to the revolutionary movements that are going on everywhere in the world.
مرگ بر جان شما نیز بگذرد، هم رونق زمان شما نیز بگذرد. هم رونق زمان شما نیز بگذرد. در مملکت تا قاره شیران گذشت و رفت این اویه سگان شما به شما ناکسان رسید. این نوبت بگذارم